Hello and welcome to Primer 2, Working with Data. So in this video we're going to be going through how to structure your data in Excel so that it loads properly and in an organized way into R. We're also going to go through how to load your data from Excel into R, and then we're going to start playing around with the data just a little bit. So first things first, we want to know how to structure a data set. And when I say structure a data set, I mean that your data has to be organized in a particular way in order for us to do stats on it in R. So here I have a data set, just a simple little data set already made up here in Excel. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out before we move forward with loading this into R. So the data is organized in a way that's called a long form. And what I mean by long form is that each row is a separate observational unit. In this case, your observational unit is a person, and so each row represents one person, with each column representing some attribute about that person. So their height, their gender, their age, their exercise level, and their metabolic rate in this case. And it's really important to have your data organized in this way in R. I'd like to point out there's a few rules just in your in the software Primer PDF about how to create data and organize data in R. There's just 5 little rules here that this data set has followed. And I'm not going to go through them in detail just for the video, but I just want to draw your attention to them so that you can skim through these before moving forward. So once you have your data organized in Excel in a long form fashion with each row representing one observational unit, what you want to do is save this as a CSV file. And we're always going to be loading our data into R as a CSV file. And the way that we do this is you go up to File, hit Save As. I'm going to save this to the folder that we created in the last video that is going to be holding all of our documents for the stats tutorial videos. So this was on my desktop, and it's just called Stats Course. And I'm going to call my file metabolic. And I'm going to make it, so we're going to go to CSV or comma delimited. There's a couple of CSV options here. If you're using Windows, you want to use this one here, CSV comma delimited. If you're using Mac, there's a couple of options. Try them out. I know that there's one that works for sure. I think all of them work for some people, but when I've run the tutorial in before, sometimes Mac users have issues with which CSV version they're using. So just be aware that there's a couple of versions, and one of them is the one that you want, though I can't recall offhandedly which one it is. So comma delimited CSV, and we're going to save that. This little warning is going to come up when you save it as a CSV. We're just going to say yes, and then that has been saved. Okay, so let's load our data into R. So when we open up R, here we have the console. I'm going to start a new script. So we go File, New Script. And I'm also going to do something that I didn't do in the last video, which is just organize these windows a little differently. I'm going to go to Windows, and I want to arrange these vertically because I like the look of that better. I'm going to start off by calling this file Primer2 with a little label, and now we're going to load our data. Okay, so before we can load our data in, we need to set a working directory, and this is in doing so, we're telling R where we want R to look for data when we load the data. So we're going to use the setwd function to set a working directory. And so I want to set my working directory to my stats course folder. But how do I know? I have to populate this function with the exact location of that file on my computer. Okay, so how do I know what the name of that location is? There's a very simple way you can do this, and I think it's almost identical between Windows and Mac users. So here I have my this is the stuff on my desktop. and then I go to stats course folder. Okay, so I have a couple things saved in this folder. If you can right click a file in that folder and go to properties, and under properties it will tell you the location. So it tells me that it's right here under users, Atom, desktop, stats course. And so what I'm going to do is just copy and paste that location straight into R. So there's a particular format that we need this to be in for set working directory to work. First of all, we need this to be in quotations. And for some reason, it doesn't like backslashes, so we need to change it to forward slashes. I actually don't think that's an issue on Mac, but for Windows, that's an issue. Okay, so we've changed these to forward slashes instead of backslashes, and then we're going to run this with Control R, and lovely, it's worked. There's no error messages coming up, so we know that it's worked. So the next thing that we're going to do is load our data into R, and we're going to do this using the read.csv command or function. And so I'm going to call the data my data just for simplicity. You might want to call it, I don't know, something more specific like metabolic or data1 or whatever you like. So we're going to go data my data equals read.csv and open the bracket, and then in quotations we're going to type in the file name right from our folder. So this is called metabolic.csv. Make sure that you've double checked your spelling. It's going to be really particular. So for example, if I call this capital M metabolic.csv, it doesn't know what that is. So it's pretended to load it, but that hasn't worked. So we want metabolic.csv. Okay, so now we've loaded our data into R, and we want to just check to make sure that this worked. So I'm going to go into my console here and call for my data. And here we have it. There's our data. If you have a really large data set, then you might want to just look at the first 6 rows of the data set. You know, instead of calling up thousands of rows, you might want just the head. Actually, I should type this in the editor so we can save this later. Okay, so head of my data. And this gives us the first 6 rows, so we can take a look. It's also important to look at the tail of the data. So we can use the tail function, because this is often where you see whether you've had errors in how you've organized it in Excel. So if you have missing data or columns don't line up or something like that, you might see it in the tail. But ours looks fine. Another useful function to do once you've first loaded data into R and you're just looking at the structure of it is to use the str function. And this tells us what type of data each of the data in our columns are. So this is interpreting, so this means that R has interpreted that the first column, name, is a factor, and height is an integer, and gender is a factor, and it gives you the number of levels and things. So this is important for us to check out, because sometimes R doesn't interpret correctly what you want the type of data to be in each column. So say sometimes you might have a type of drug in your data, and there's 3 drugs just called drug 1, 2, and 3. If they're just called 1, 2, and 3 in the data set, R will interpret that as an integer, even though we might want it to be a factor. So sometimes you have to force R to call things, to interpret things as being a factor or an integer. And the way that we do that is during the loading the data phase. So say for example, my data had been, I didn't want these to be integers, I wanted them to be numeric values. I could change that when I load the data. So I'm going to reload my data here to show you how that works. So my data equals read.csv metabolic.csv. And now I'm going to use, within this, I'm going to use a function called column classes. equals C, open bracket. And now, in the correct order that the columns appear, so I'm going by name, height, gender, age, exercise level, and metabolic rate, I'm going to type in what I want each of those columns to be. So name, I want to be a factor. Height, I want to be numeric. So you'll notice that I'm putting spaces in between these two, in between factor and numeric. Doesn't matter. You can just, as long as they're separated by a comma, it'll do the same thing. I don't know, organizationally for me, I like putting spaces. Okay, so the next one I want to be a factor. You can fast forward the video slightly if you would like. I'm just going to be typing in what I want each of these to be. Oh, almost forgot one of those. And then close the bracket on the C command, and then close the bracket on the whole thing, and load the data. And no error messages have come up, so we should be good. And now, when we ask for my data, that should come up okay, and when we check the structure using str for my data, we see that this has come up correctly now. It's a factor, a number, a factor, a number, a factor, and a number, just like we wanted. Okay, perfect. A couple other things that I'd like to draw your attention to. If you want to look at only a particular part of the data set, so for example, you only want to call a particular column, you can use that using, you can do that using the number signs. You can go my data number sign name, and that'll give you all the values in the name column. So similarly, you can go my data height, and it will give you all the numbers in the height column. You can also do things like, well, we can take the mean of height, and it'll give us that. One last thing that I'll do here in this video, just because it's fun and I'm sure you're dying to see what some of this precious data looks like that we've loaded, I'm just going to make a little box plot. So I'm going to say for my box plot, okay, make a box plot. For the sake of the box plot, I'm going to say that my vectors are x equals my data exercise level. I'm going to say that the y is going to be my data metabolic rate. You'll note that because we're doing a box plot, on the x value we have a categorical type variable or a factor, and on the y value we have a numerical value, and that's how you make a box plot. So I'm going to make a box plot of y tilde x. That's actually what the tilde is used for. And let's take a look at what that data looks like. Oh, this is a good opportunity. So I've run this. Oh, did I forget to run this? There we go. And there you have it, a box plot of our data. So that's how we organize data and load it into R. And I will see you next video.